Welcome back to the workshop. Today we are going to be making a super fancy, really cool Bowie knife. It's going to have a super interesting, unique pattern that I have yet to see done. It's kind of a combination of some of my favorite patterns, twisted W's, Turkish twist, and feather pattern in a really unique way that you will see as I forge out this Damascus. It's going to feature some super duper fancy, really cool mammoth molar. So this is the molar tooth from a woolly mammoth. And it's also probably gonna have some Damascus fittings, maybe some stainless steel fittings. I still haven't quite figured that out, but we'll figure it out as we go along. The first step in making this rather large Bowie knife is to forge out the Damascus, the initial billet, and we're gonna need a lot of steel.
To make our billet, I'm using alternating layers of 1084 and 15N20 high carbon steel. As you can see here, I'm just using the MIG welder to tack weld them all together so I can forge weld them securely. Forge welding is just a process of bringing the steel up to just below its melting temperature, at which point it gets kinda sticky. So when you apply pressure, the pieces of steel actually stick together, forming one homogeneous piece of steel. And to apply that pressure, I'm using my 25-ton hydraulic press. I'm pretty sure all of you are probably familiar with a Damascus pattern of some sort, but the question often comes up, what makes the Damascus pattern visible on the steel? Well, a Damascus pattern is simply two different steels forge welded together like I'm doing here. One of these steels commonly has a high nickel content, so it resists the acid used to etch the steel, thus resulting in that beautiful contrasting pattern. The pattern that I'm making here is actually a combination of 4 different Damascus patterns, each of which can be really cool by themselves. It's a combination of crushed W's, twist Damascus, multi-bar, and feather. To make this billet, I'm starting off by making my crushed W pattern. To make the first C layer, as we call it, you basically just have to upset the layers onto themselves, so crushing the layers sideways so they form a kind of radiating C pattern. As you could see earlier, I was using the square dies to crush the corners in and make that C even more pronounced. The billet is getting very long now because I'm simply drawing it out in preparation for cutting and restacking to multiply how many W's we have. I'm shooting for 10 layers of 4 inches, so I need this billet to be at least 42 inches long to allow for offcuts and waste material.
It's getting a little stormy outside.
There's a storm coming, Harry, and we best be ready when she does. Hagrid!
That's a big bar of steel. Now that we have this big bar here, the next steps are going to be using this massive angle grinder to get all of the scale off of there, and then switching to the surface grinder attachment, really clean up all those pieces, get them ready to restack, and then multiply how many W's we have right here. Obviously, always got to have your personal protective equipment. These really nice new behind the neck ear protection from Benchmark Abrasives. Also, of course, respirator and safety glasses and my customized apron. So let's get to it.
This step is extremely important because if the steel has any scale or slag or any bumps or anything in it, that's risking improper forge welds, inclusions, and delaminations. I did not actually film the cutting up of the steel, but I did it on my horizontal bandsaw. I just forgot to film it.
'Cause I'm a big old dummy.
And here you can see I'm just using the MIG welder again to tack weld all the pieces together prior to forge welding. You may remember I said I wanted 10 pieces to stack up instead of 9 as you saw there. Well, one of the pieces by the end cut just had a little delam in there that snuck in from the end cut that I didn't see when I was cutting it up, so I had to scrap it. It won't negatively affect the pattern at all, but it does mean I have slightly less steel to work with.
All right, so the next step is I'm gonna use this pencil to draw this billet out, right? I'm gonna draw it out to a square bar, and then I'm gonna twist it.
So obviously that was a play on words joke, but the pencil literally exploded. It was super loud in person and it sent chunks of graphite flying everywhere. After I make sure the billet is securely forge welded, I begin to draw it out into a longer bar that I can then twist to form our twisted W's pattern. My 25-ton press makes short work of drawing out this monstrous billet, and I use a combination of the drawing dies and the flat dies to ensure that everything stays correctly oriented as it's lengthening out. So as you can see here, I've gotten my billet drawn out into a really long square bar, and now I'm breaking the corners to make it into a round bar. This is because when you're twisting, if you have those big corners protruding, they create cold shuts, which makes it even more difficult to flatten it because they risk splitting open. This bar is massive, and my plan is to basically mark the center point, twist one half one direction and the other half the other direction to give us our alternating twist multi-bar pattern. So I ended up twisting each side 20 times. So one side I twisted counterclockwise and the other side I twisted clockwise. And now I'm very carefully drawing it out into a super long 1-inch wide by 1/4 inch bar to then cut up and restack before re-feather it.
That billet is way too long. I think I need to cut it in half. Here's how to cut the billet in half. There we go.
Hands down, the most tricky and interesting part of this pattern is that I have so many multi-bars and that I'm drawing them out vertically instead of horizontally like you'd normally see in a Turkish twist pattern. And I'm not 100% sure how it's going to look in the end because this is an experimental pattern, so I'm just really excited to get to the next steps.
Alright, so we have the twisted bars cut up into 18 sections, 9 each way, so 9 of alternating twisting this way and 9 going this way, and we have numbered them out so we know what order they're in, because that'll be important for this next step. We need to mirror the twist rate as it goes up in the Turkish twist pattern that we're going to be doing before we feather it, because if you don't do that, you're going to have kind of sporadic twists, and the variances in the twisting consistency, even though I did my best to keep it as uniform as possible, will be pretty noticeable. So we're gonna start alternating these up and get them stacked up, welded up, and ready for the final forge weld and then the feather. This is gonna be a very tall billet. It'll be this tall, which is about 5.5 inches tall before we do the forge weld. So we're gonna compress that down to 4 inches and then we're gonna do the feather split. Okay, so we have our billet. Everything is stacked up in alternating layers. So top layer, no, the twist is going this way. Next layer, this way. This way, this way. So that's what makes up what's usually called a Turkish twist, just an alternating multi-bar twist. This has 18 bars. So we have 18 pieces of twisted Damascus here, and what we're going to do is feather it. But before you do any feather, a few things need to be done. I've already done one of them, which is grind the sides completely flat and flush, and then weld a ladder is what I call it. So you have each seam horizontally welded, and then you have these ones stretching this way. And this is because when you're feathering the billet, it wants to split at the ends because there's so much pressure being pushed into the steel. So having these welds there and having it completely flush is gonna allow those forge welds to stick very solidly and not rip apart. The second thing that we're just about to do is grind the faces so they're perfectly flush and flat. This is because there's also pressure being applied outwards during the splitting process. So when you're doing your splitting, sometimes what you'll get is D-lams on the faces as well. So what I'm gonna do is not weld every single seam on the face. Instead, I'm going to grind it flush so that when I forge weld it, there's no differences or overhangs in the layers that might trigger a shear when you go to split it down the middle. So I'm gonna get over to the grinder and grind these faces flush while I heat up the forge.
After I'm done cleaning off all the sides of the billet, I soak it in kerosene before I put it in the forge. This basically creates an oxygen negative space between the layers when it burns out, and it also can help burn out any grease or grime that might be stuck between the layers after welding them together. To ensure a good forge weld before I do any feather splitting, I heat this thing up to piping hot, nearly 2400 degrees, and after going through a few light welding passes to make sure everything's forge welded together, I move the work handle to the face so I can hold it while I split the billet in half. The purpose of the splitting process is to use a dull wedge and smash it through the steel while it's at forge welding temperature, basically dragging the layers that it touches downward so that when you forge weld it back together, it creates that beautiful sweeping feather pattern radiating out from that central seam. This split was dead straight, resulting in two perfectly even and flat pieces of steel that are going to be easy to forge weld back together.
Alright y'all, I am so excited about this. That feather split went absolutely perfectly. I used a slightly sharper wedge so that I would get a more subtle feather instead of a very aggressive one because this billet is so wide, but you can actually see those layers being dragged down there, and it went perfectly right down the center. So I'm just gonna pop it apart here. So as you can see, I did not compress it like this at all after the split. That's because I want the meeting faces, the joining faces, I want to be completely undisturbed. Now I'm going to go in, grind off all the scale on the surfaces, grind off all these weld beads back here, and get this thing ready to forge weld back together, draw out into our blade. This is gonna be so cool. I'm very excited to see what this pattern looks like. I've never seen somebody feather a multi-bar twist before, especially lengthwise, like along the blade. This will be really, really interesting.
After grinding the two pieces flush and throwing a couple MIG beads on the top and bottom of the billet to hold it together for the initial forge weld, it's back to the forge to forge this thing out into our blade. Any bladesmith knows that wonderful feeling you get when you nail the final forge weld on a complex Damascus pattern, and all that's left is to draw it out, forge it into a knife, get it ready for grinding so you can surface grind it, test etch it, and see that beautiful pattern. Now, this is actually one of the most risky parts of this entire build, just drawing this billet out, because you have to remember there are weld seams running parallel to the drawing dies the entire time that I am drawing this billet out. This means that if I apply too much pressure, if I try to forge it when it's too cold, or if I don't get it hot enough before forging, I could split open one of those seams, which would ruin the entire billet. Now that I have the blade to thickness and rough profile, I'm moving over to the anvil to tweak the profile a little bit to match my stencil that I've drawn onto the anvil. Now that the blade is done being forged, I start drawing out the tang. Before I can actually start forging, as you can see there, I cut a little groove in with the angle grinder, which will prevent some of that material by the heel from being pulled down into the tang as well. I have to be very careful while doing this that I don't split any of those layers that are, again, running horizontally to the blade. If I can do this with nothing opening up and no seams popping, that means I have really strong forge welds all the way around. Throughout the entire process of drawing out this blade and the tang, not a single seam opened up, which I'm very pleased with, because the failure rate on projects like this can be pretty high if you're not careful. After tweaking the profile and getting it exactly where I want it on the anvil, I move over to the full flat dies and get it perfectly flat and ready for thermal cycling.
Now that the blade has been forged and thermocycled, so it has been normalized and annealed, basically what that does is it resets the grain structure in the steel, gets it nice and soft so it's really easy to work and it's not going to warp or crack during the quench.
Since I don't have a really big surface grinder, I have to manually surface grind both of the surfaces to be perfectly flat and parallel and even thickness all the way through down to the 1,000th of an inch. This may seem excessive, but it comes in handy down the road.
Alright, so here we go. The blade has now been surface ground and I have the profile that I've cut out here traced on it with a marker. Now I'm going to come to the outsides of these marker lines, but I'm not going to go past them or to the inside because the marker can bleed a little bit, and I just want to get the general profile roughed in. After that, I'm going to then make my reference side right here. So this flat straight line right there is going to be the reference point for everything else in the entire knife. This line, this point, this line, the sides, everything is gonna be based on that straight flat line right there. So let's get to the grinder and let's get this ground to shape.
So my camera wasn't recording when I was trying to film the profiling process. Basically what that is I set my work rest to 90 degrees exactly, and I use progressively higher grit belts to dial in the outside profile of the knife. You can see what I'm doing here is basically breaking the corners on the tang and dialing in those shoulders, which will make it a lot easier to fit up to the guard later on. On these really thick Bowie knives, I like to add shoulders on all 4 sides of the tang, so when it fits up with the guard, there's absolutely no gaps anywhere.
So now we have the blade finished profiled up to 400 grit. We have these surfaces up to 400 grit, and then we have that step ground in. We're gonna have to refine this after heat treat, obviously, because of decarb, but I will put a little bit of anti-scaling solution here just to keep any scale off what will be the flat of the knife, because this will be a full flat ground knife, so we're not gonna have to worry about much scale formation or decarbonization happening on the spine or anything, because there's not gonna be a flat going this way. So now I have blue dicom on all of the surfaces where there's going to be bevels ground in. So I just take my height gauge that I have set to leave me a 40,000 thick edge prior to heat treat, and I'm just gonna go all the way along the edge, marking the center so that I can do my rough grinds before heat treat. So now you can see I have these lines scribed in on the spine and on the edge. So I'm gonna go grind to those lines, but I'm not gonna go all the way back to my final level here. I'm gonna grind probably about right here. I'm gonna go up to probably about right there.
So pre-heat treat grinds aren't just, knocking the corners off. I'm actually removing a fair amount of material. This is because it's much harder to grind once the steel is hardened after heat treat. But you still have to be very precise with it and take off nearly exactly the same material on either side to prevent any kind of warping from more mass being on one side than the other.
So I'm all done with the pre-heat treat grinds on this big, beautiful knife here. We got those grind lines looking absolutely fantastic. A little bit of flat left, which will help us with straightening, and the clip is rough ground in as well. That edge is down to a nice even thickness on the back and the front. So hopefully this will mean minimal, if any, warping happening during heat treat, and there's going to be very little stress on the blade. And we've kept the thicker portions to a minimum to make sure that this thing hardens all the way through. Kiln is heating up, so let's go quench this thing.
This knife was so thick that I had to make sure the oil was preheated to about 125 degrees and agitated a lot in the quench, as you will see me doing here, just moving it back and forth. Whenever you're quenching a knife, make sure that it's in a well-ventilated area and that you wear a respirator. I totally forgot to put my respirator on here, so I got a face full of oil vapor, which probably wasn't what the doctor ordered.
All right, guys, so we have the blade out of heat treat, quenching and tempering, and it is now a hardened blade. Did get a little tiny bit of warping. I have simply put it down on a surface plate with sandpaper on it, so you can see those points of contact. Just a tiny little bit of warping going on there, but nothing that can't be ground out. And I also used my carbide tipped hammer a little bit right there to kind of fix a slightly larger warp that had formed. But we are now ready to start surface grinding this thing and getting the surfaces nice and flat, and that's how they will stay before hand sanding. So the next step is to get this flat right here up to a nice even flat 400 grit. And as we do that, we're going to be using our digital calipers and measuring top and bottom of that ricasso. Make sure that they are exactly the same. Right now they are. It's going to be really tricky with this oddly shaped flat to keep them perfect. So we're going to take our surface plate with sandpaper over to the grinder, and we're going to get going.
I would normally use a disc sander to flatten small areas like this, but the disc sander that I have has a slight dish in it that has developed over time, so I don't really trust it that much, so I just do it all by hand. I'm using an A45 Trizact belt for this because it's very, very mild. It does not rip off a lot of material and it's easy to control. That being said, this is an extremely tricky process and really tests if you have a steady hand or not. After making sure that the ricasso and the small flat are all really, really even and up to 600 grit, I move on to grinding the main bevels. Easily the most difficult part about grinding bevels, especially on a big Bowie knife like this, is the plunge lines and getting them all dialed in. So here we are moving on to some 600 grit and 400 grit sandpaper and some diamond files, and really just tweaking them. This process takes a very long time, a lot of unclamping it, looking at it in good lighting, re-clamping it, and adjusting things over and over again.
So we got the main bevel finish ground up to 600 grit. That is an A30 Trizac belt. And we also, this was the trickiest part, got this choil area and the transition of the plunge line and the flat also pretty dialed in. It's not completely done, but it is very close. So now what we can do is we can get this edge convexed. So basically we're going to tape off the spine here and then convex the edge, the slack of the belt over there. And then after that, we can move on to clip on the back. And that is gonna be very tricky. One slip of my hand and it can annihilate the entire piece. I'm gonna have to be very, very, very careful and take my time working mostly with a 120 grit belt.
Convexing the edge on the knife is very important because it adds stability to the edge and reinforces it so it can take abuse while still having a very nice thin edge for fine cuts. I do this by masking off the spine of the knife and using the slack of the belt to round over the edge slightly and give me a convex edge geometry. Here you can see me using a work rest and an extra piece of steel that I CA glued onto it to ensure that I keep the exact same angle the entire time that I'm grinding the clip on the spine of the knife.
Here is the knife with the clip finish ground. I did a near zero grind on the clip, and getting this transition right here nice and crispy, probably the most difficult part of the whole thing. Getting that transition to be really, really nice and symmetrical on both sides, that took a while, but we got it looking absolutely fantastic. Finish ground up to 600 grit on all surfaces. Top and the bottom of the choil are all up to grit. Tang has been cleaned off and straightened, so now it is finally time for the part I all have been waiting for. The test etch. So let's get this thing cleaned off with some acetone, throw it in some ferrochloride, and see what this pattern is looking like.
I decided to use some instant coffee instead of ferrochloride to give some extra contrast, and man, this pattern is unlike any pattern I've ever seen.
So guys, here it is, the beautiful feather Damascus Bowie knife, test etched, did a coffee etch to really bring out that contrast. You can get a good idea what this pattern is gonna look like. It is finished ground, ready to hand sand. But before we do any of that, next step is going to be moving on to the handle, which I will be doing in the next video, part 2 of this build. So if you've watched this far, thank you so much for watching. This has been a super fun build, and I am extremely happy with this result, and I'm super excited to move on to the next steps and really see where this thing goes, because it feels beautiful. It's nice and thick, the taper's there, the continued clip on the spine, everything, the subtle recurve in that blade, just a very subtle recurve, that flat transition. I am loving it. So I want to know what you guys think of this, so leave it down in the comments. What do you think of this project? It's certainly the most complex feather pattern I've ever made. I'm really, really liking how it looks. Here's another close-up so you can really see some of that pattern with scale. This is a very large knife. That beautiful clip in there. We got that facet running right here. Super stoked about this blade. It's gonna be an absolute tank of a Bowie knife, and that mammoth molar handle is gonna make it all pop even more with the beautiful fittings that I'm gonna put on there. So again, thank you so much for watching. Consider subscribing if you wanna see me make more cool stuff like this. Part 2 of this series will be coming out very soon, so subscribe and turn on those notifications if you want to see this knife completed, and I promise you the next video with the handle and all the intricate parts that I'm going to be doing with that will be much, much more exciting. Plus, you'll get to see the finished blade at the end. So until that next video, see ya.